What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtonette. In today's episode, I'm going over a much-anticipated video, the top contenders in the Big Ten Conference. There are 4 teams that I think a lot of people consider to be the top tier of the Big Ten. So I'm going to be going over each of those 4 teams. But before I do, if you're going to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like on this video, consider subscribing to the channel, turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But let's dive straight into things here. And the team that I have, this is in no particular order. I guess maybe it's the perceived order nationally to some people. But I'm going to start out with the Penn State Nittany Lions. Out of these teams, I think they probably close with Michigan, but have the lowest expectations. I think most people consider Ohio State and Oregon to be the top. But Penn State was 10-3 last year, 7-2 in conference. They bring back 13 starters, 6 on both offense and defense. Their big question mark is going to be Drew Aller. He was very efficient last year. He only threw 2 interceptions, but the Nittany Lions offense struggled to make those big plays last year. In fact, they had just 47 key plays, or in this case, plays of 20 or more yards, which ranked 97th in the FBS. So they're bringing in Kansas offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki, in place of Mike Yurcich. And he led the Jayhawks offense into really a surge forward offensively. They had 76 big plays, which ranked tied for 17th in the nation. So they're going to be hoping that he can bring that in. Aller last year threw for 2,631 yards, 25 touchdowns, and again, then those just 2 interceptions, which was big because as a team, the Nittany Lions did a really good job of turning the ball over, taking the ball away on defense. So combining that with what they did on offense allowed them to have a successful year. Of course, they still fell behind Ohio State and Michigan. Offensively as well, running back kind of tandem, Nick Singleton and Caton Allen combined for over 1,600 yards and 14 touchdowns. Those 2 guys are going to be key factors again for this offense, which brings back 2 offensive linemen. So they're going to have to kind of retool on the line, but overall, the offense has some of their key pieces coming back. They were 12th in scoring. They were 28th in the rush, and they ranked just 77th in passing yards nationally. So they're going to need to step that up. The addition of Julian Fleming, who is a recruit originally from Pennsylvania, had considered the Nittany Lions before committing to the Buckeyes. He's coming to Penn State this year as a transfer, and alongside him are Harrison Wallace III and tight end Tyler Warren. So this Penn State offense is going to need to take some steps forward, I think, if they want to match up with the Ohio State, Oregon, and Michigan teams. But I think they have certainly the potential, and I think the addition of Kotelnicki will be big for the offense. Defensively, not much needs to be changed, but they will have a new defensive coordinator as Tom Allen, the former Indiana head coach, comes in, replacing Manny Diaz, who took the head coaching job at Duke. This unit ranked 3rd nationally in scoring. They were the best against the rush, ranking 1st. They were 2nd in total defense and 7th against the pass. Mentioned that turnover margin was plus 16 last, and they really didn't even need to have that many because they often kept the ball on offense. Defensively, coming back is defensive end Abdul Carter, who was a first-team All-Big Ten selection last year. He's moving from linebacker to kind of more of that edge position as they install a 4-2-5 defense. And he's obviously going to need to replace the production of both Chop Robinson, who was a first-round draft pick, and Adisa Isaac, who was a third-round draft pick. But joining him pairing with him will be Danny Dennis Sutton on the defensive line as well. They kind of run a rotation. I think this was last year. They had 6 defensive ends and 5 defensive tackles. The defensive tackles are Zane Durant and Devon Ellies. They aim to continue what they've done really the last couple years, and last year ranking 1st nationally in sacks, so they will hope that can continue. Linebacker Colby King is kind of the main guy to look at, returning starter there in the middle of the defense. And then safeties KJ Winston and Jalen Reed lead from the back. And a solid pickup, a good addition from Georgia is cornerback AJ Harris. Their schedule is honestly pretty favorable. They avoid both Michigan and Oregon. They do open on the road against a West Virginia team that I think has an opportunity to take some major strides forward this year, especially in a more open Big 12. they've also got road games at USC and Wisconsin, and the home game that they have, the tough one, is against Ohio State. Those games, Wisconsin, Ohio State, are back-to-back weeks, playing a physical Wisconsin team, then going up against a tough Ohio State team. That'll be a quick turnaround for them. I think it's October 26th and November 2nd. Those will be two big games for the Nittany Lions. Other than that, I really don't see a loss on their schedule. I really don't see them losing to West Virginia. USC is a little bit of a toss-up. If the LA Memorial Coliseum was a little bit more of home field advantage, I would say I'd side with the Trojans here, but I think the Nittany Lions win that one. Wisconsin's tough, but I think they're able to get a road win at Camp Randall as well. So I think really the only game that they have is the Ohio State game, and they can afford to lose that one. I'll talk more about the Buckeyes obviously later in this video. I think that probably is a win for the Buckeyes, but I think this Penn State team could fairly easily finish 11-1, 8-1 in the conference, which could potentially, depending on what happens with Oregon and Michigan and Ohio State, send them to the Big Ten championship game. And at the very least, they're a lock for the college football playoff if they can get those key road wins. And that's the key. If they lose one of those games, there will be bigger stakes for them against Ohio State. And as long as they don't slip up in a game they should win, the Nittany Lions, I think, are a pretty comfortable lock for making the college football playoff this year, especially if their defense continues to play at the level that they have and the offense takes a couple strides forward. Next up is Michigan. They are obviously the reigning national champions, 15-0 last year, 9-0 in conference, won the Big Ten and the national title. A question that's come up in the last couple days, it was an issue that seemed to be resolved from last year, but is there a possibility of sanctions coming in? They played really well when that was a distraction last year. They really were able to separate that from playing on the field and were able to continue getting wins. We'll see what happens with Sharon Moore, if there's any sort of suspension would probably be the heaviest consequence, or if there's any just sort of other sanctions. I doubt that happens before the start of the season, just a few weeks away now, but we'll have to stay tuned for that. They have five starters returning, 1 on offense, 3 on defense. New for the Wolverines is obviously Sharon Moore, a head coach. He's a Jim Harbaugh protege, and I don't think that will be an adjustment. Quarterbacks coach Kurt Campbell got promoted offensive coordinator, and then they bring in defensive coordinator Wink Martindale, who has some really good NFL experience. Donovan Edwards for Blake Corum at running back. The Don has some really good experience. Obviously, he ran roughshod over Ohio State in the shoe a couple of years ago. He'll be coming in full-time at running back. He'll be the guy for the Michigan rushing attack. It's a totally new offensive line. All 5 starters from last year are gone either to the NFL or to graduation. A good pickup from Northwestern is Josh Preby. And then the question to answer really for this Wolverines team, I think more than anything, especially on the offensive side of the ball, is can Alex Orji or Jack Tuttle, whichever one is able to win the QB job, fill J.J. McCarthy's shoes? Much like Drew Aller, McCarthy isn't a quarterback who's going to throw for even, really for 3,000 or 4,000 yards, but he's going to really manage the game well. He's going to get his team the yards, the touchdowns that they need. He's going to put them in a good position and play smart football. That's what either Orji or Tuttle is going to have to do, whoever wins that job, or if it's somebody else. But that's the big question to answer. If they can answer that, I think Michigan is in a really good position to compete once again for the Big Ten title. And wide receivers, Samaj Morgan and Tyler Morris weren't technically starters last year, but they have some of that starting or at least regular experience. And tight end Colston Loveland, I believe, is their only full-time returning starter from last year, and he's a valuable piece of the pass game as well. This defense, of course, was probably the best defense nationally, and they certainly proved it by the national championship. They were first overall in both scoring and total defense. They ranked second in pass defense and 5th against the rush. Returning are a couple of defensive tackles, Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. Graham was more of a regular starter. Grant didn't start for most of the year, but he has, like some of the other guys on offense, those receivers that I mentioned, some valuable experience. He was really big, I believe, especially in the national championship game. Graham was the defensive Rose Bowl MVP. I've talked about those guys in another video before. But also Josiah Stewart at defensive end. He had some valuable experience last year. He's a really good player. And then cornerback Will Johnson was a first-team All-Big Ten selection. A tough loss for these Wolverines is Rod Moore, who suffered a torn ACL in the spring. That would be some valuable experience at safety to pair with strong safety Makari Page. But I think they'll still be in a really good position defensively because they had a lot of depth last year, and that will allow them to have a pretty smooth adjustment, I think, to this year. The other guys, Jay Sean Barham coming in from Maryland, and then nickelback Zeke Berry and another cornerback, Jair Hill. Their schedule is, I think, the toughest in the Big Ten, kind of in contrast to their schedule last year, which was relatively easy. They have Texas and USC at home, I think both in the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season. They go to Washington on the road, a rematch of the national championship, and then they host Oregon and USC. So they get all the big games. I guess they are fortunate to avoid Penn State, but they have those other teams in the Big Ten who are kind of right around there competing, especially the big dogs, Oregon and Ohio State. Those are 2 huge games for the Wolverines this year. That'll be very tough. They go to Columbus this year. That'll be a game that they are obviously looking to win. I don't know if they'll be expected to win this year. I guess, they've won the last 3 years, so maybe that is the expectation. I'd imagine Ohio State's favored in that game, but that will ultimately, I think that one for Michigan will be high stakes. I imagine Ohio State comes into that one with at most 1 loss. I think Michigan probably comes into that game with maybe 2 losses. And so that could be their season on the line. It might not be for the Big Ten championship, but it might be to, avoid that potential 3rd loss. Then coming in next is Oregon. Again, this isn't in the necessarily the order that I project things to shake out. Oregon was 12-2 last year, 8-1 in the Pac-12. Their offense was electric last year. They ranked 2nd in scoring and total offense, and they were the number 1 passing attack in the country. They bring back 6 starters on offense, including 3 offensive linemen. Tackles Johnny Cornelius is an NFL caliber player, along with Josh Connerly Jr. Quarterback Dylan Gabriel comes in from Oklahoma. I think he is a Heisman contender, especially with the rest of this offense. I think some people might be overhyping him a little bit, but I think he does deserve a lot of the hype that he gets, and I think this offensive attack will continue to do what they did last year. Maybe not the best in the country passing the ball, but they're certainly, I think, going to be up there in the top 10. Wide receivers Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart. Stewart comes in from Texas A&M. Johnson returns. He received 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns last year. And then Terrence Ferguson is also a valuable option. Those guys are going to have to step up and replace Bo Nix, Troy Franklin, and then those offensive linemen that I mentioned are going to have to step up for Jackson Powers Johnson. Running back this year will be Jordan James. He had a good amount of carries last year, but he'll be replacing the full-time running back Bucky Irving. I think they should be in a good position in the rushing attack. Defensively, they ranked 9th in scoring, 10th against the rush, 22nd total. They were a little bit lower against the pass, but overall probably top 15 defense, kind of averaging those rankings out. They also had a plus 11 turnover margin. Their linebackers are in the middle of their defense, and they're kind of the leaders as well. Jeffrey Bassa is a 4-year starter. Justin Jacobs, originally from Iowa. I think he was in Oregon last year as well. Those are 2 solid players. And then sophomore, Devin Jackson emerged as kind of the most improved player in the spring, is what the defensive coordinator Tosh Lupoy said. So he will be somebody to watch as well in kind of that linebacker grouping. On the defensive line, over the last couple of seasons, the Ducks have acquired 11 blue chip, which is kind of considered the 4 or 5 stars on the defensive line. Obviously, they don't have all 11 of those guys on the roster still. I think maybe some of them have transferred out. But they have a lot of that, again, blue chip talent on the defensive line. Leading that is Jordan Birch. And then in the secondary, it's kind of shifted a little bit. They have a lot of guys coming in from the portal. They don't really have one guy who stood out that's coming back from last year. Cornerback Jabbar Muhammad comes in from Washington. He was somebody that was really tough against the Ducks last year playing for the Huskies, and is I think probably one of the best cornerbacks, certainly in the Big Ten, perhaps nationally. And then UTSA transfer Cam Alexander also comes in. Safety Kobe Savage comes in from Kansas State, and nickelback Brandon Johnson comes in from Duke. This team, I think, has a schedule that has a couple of, mines here or there that they'll have to avoid. I think Boise State at home even is one, week 2 of the season. Home against Ohio State, that's the big one. It's October 12th. That one it could potentially decide which of these two teams goes to the Big Ten championship if Penn State ends up with 1 or no losses in conference. Then they also go on the road at Michigan and at Wisconsin, and then they host Washington to wrap up the regular season. I think these Ducks are not only Big Ten contenders, I think they're national championship contenders. Do they match up with Ohio State even, or Georgia and Texas out of the SEC? I'm not sure about that. I think they might be a step behind, but I'm also pretty high on these Ducks. I think they could compete with those teams. But the team that they're going to have to get past is, of course, I guess on the schedule, first of all, Ohio State, but then also, most importantly, Michigan as the 3-time reigning Big Ten champs and the national champs. But talking about those Buckeyes, the last team of the main contenders in the Big Ten, they went 11-2 last year, 8-1 in conference. And their big question is, can the bevy of new additions get them over the Michigan hump? They've lost the last 3 meetings against the Wolverines. They haven't beaten the Wolverines since 2019. Can they get over that hump this year? They have other obstacles along the way, but that game will be the big one, and it is possible that they go into that game with high stakes. Now, if both of those teams have won, or if one has 1 loss, and the other has no losses, it might not mean that much. But if either one of these teams has 2 losses going into that matchup, it could be big. I think Michigan could get into the playoff with 3 losses because their schedule is tougher. I don't think Ohio State has the same luxury. Talking about those additions, though, obviously Chip Kelly comes in as the offensive coordinator from UCLA. He did a really good job as a head coach at Oregon. He even said it himself that he's better suited as an offensive coordinator because he can go out there, call the plays, doesn't have to worry about the NIL stuff, their recruiting and all that. I think that'll be a major positive for the Buckeyes. Running back Quinshon Judkins comes in from Ole Miss, joining Travion Henderson in the Buckeye backfield. Center Seth McLaughlin comes in from Alabama, and the one who probably is the most questioned out of these additions is Will Howard. I'm honestly not exceptionally high on this transfer. I think he's a solid quarterback, but I think there's a reason he was, knocked out of Manhattan, Kansas, and I think that's because of the talent of Avery Johnson. I think he will be a solid addition. I think if he can manage the game well, if he can place the throws where he needs to, even if he could play to the level of how Kyle McCord did last year, I think that'll be enough. He even said, though, he doesn't have to go out there and be a superhero. He just kind of has to go and get the job done. And that'll be helped by, of course, this wide receiver core. Emeka Ibuka, Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, and Brandon Innes, along with tight end G. Scott, make up probably the best wide receiver tandem in college football. Certainly, I would say in the Big Ten. And then also 3 offensive linemen come back to the team this year. They were the number 1 defense against the pass, number 2 in scoring, number 3 in total, and then struggled a little bit more, 27th against the rush. But overall, I would say a top 5 defense. Those rush struggles, though, will have to be addressed because a team like Michigan runs the ball really well. And a few other teams, like in Iowa that they faced this year, also runs the ball pretty well, although not like Iowa really does anything too well on offense, but of their offense, they run the ball a little bit better. So games like that where a team can run the ball, being able to stop that will be important. I think they probably won't need that as much outside of that Michigan game, though. They've got Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau coming back at defensive end, and then senior defensive tackles Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton. In the secondary, they have a pair of second-team All-Americans. Cornerback Denzel Burke is coming back, and then safety Caleb Downs comes in from Alabama. Also at cornerback is Davison Igbinosun, and then nickelback Jordan Hancock and strong safety Lathan Ransom. Linebacker Cody Simon is kind of a pretty dependable linebacker. The question is more at their will linebacker position. Is it going to be CJ Hicks or Sonny Styles? And whichever one wins that job, will he be able to avoid being potentially a liability for the defense? That's not to say that either one of those players is a liability. It's just simply to say that kind of out of this defense, if you're going to nitpick in one area, it would be at that kind of will linebacker position. But both of those guys are very talented and I think should be able to plug in very well, and they might rotate a little bit. Then that schedule, they have kind of 4 games that are important. That Iowa game, they get the Hawkeyes at home. That's a game I would not want to play at Kinnick Stadium this year. I think that should be a win at home. Then they've got those road games at Oregon and Penn State. I honestly think they split those. I could see them losing either one, but I think that's a split. And then home against Michigan. I want to say I think that'll be a win for the Buckeyes this year, but it has been 5 years since the Buckeyes last defeated the Wolverines. And again, I think the Wolverines will have some really high stakes in that one. So I'm not going to make a call on that one yet. I do think, though, that it is between Ohio State and Oregon, I think, for talent. Penn State, though, is, I think, among this group, maybe a little bit of a sleeper. And that's not to say that people don't expect them to do well, but I think a lot of people are expecting them to finish kind of behind both Ohio State and Oregon. But honestly, I could see those Nittany Lions finishing top of the conference, at least in the regular season, or certainly right now, I kind of see a 3-way tie. I could see Oregon being able to defeat Ohio State. I think Penn State maybe loses to Ohio State, and Oregon, I could easily see them going undefeated in the conference, but because that's so hard to do, I have them for potentially losing to either Michigan or a road game at Wisconsin. Michigan is very much a toss-up right now. I could see them splitting the games against Ohio State and Oregon. I think they lose that game early in the season as they kind of, adjust to new things without Jim Harbaugh. If that Texas game was even like a week or two later, maybe I'd go with the Wolverines, but Texas also proved last year they can beat a tough opponent on the road. So when it comes down to it, I do actually think in a Big Ten championship game, I think Oregon can get the job done in their first season in the Big Ten. The only thing that really affects is getting a bye in the first week, which is, of course, important. But at the same time, whoever loses that game will easily be hosting a college football playoff first-round game. So let me know your thoughts below on which of these 4 teams is the best team in the Big Ten this year. Let me know who you think will emerge and be that, potentially number 1 or number 2 seed in the college football playoff bracket come December. But that's all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.